Welcome back, DP Review TV viewers. It's Jordan Drake here, and you might be thinking, hey, wait a second, I thought I saw a Blackmagic 12K video on my feed earlier, and yes, there definitely was. However, the A-roll that we shot with that was quite underexposed. When we brought it up, the quality wasn't very good. So unfortunately, we weren't able to reshoot that on the Blackmagic 12K camera. It's already been shipped out. So we're filming this on the S1H, but bear in mind, we're gonna have tons of samples from the Blackmagic 12K camera. Now, fortunately, our really good friend Levi Hallwell was able to take this camera onto a lit set to shoot some BTS of a photography shoot that Glean Productions was doing. So that means you'll get to see some of the results from this camera in a variety of lighting situations. And honestly, this isn't really a review for a couple of reasons. First of all, I haven't used a lot of the competing cinema cameras. Last time I really used a cinema camera on a project was the film A Walk Down to Water like 3 years ago. On top of that, I do think there's a lot of really interesting technology here that we could really see being benefit if it came into some mirrorless cameras. Now, before we get started, I want to say I did not have the equipment I needed to support this camera, so huge thanks to Glean Productions, especially Noah Fallis here in town for outfitting us with some equipment, and the camera store here in town as well for getting us some PL lenses so we were able to properly test this. But let's get to the real question: what can mirrorless cameras learn from the Blackmagic 12K? So let's start off talking about the sensor. That is definitely the headline feature. It is a 12K Super 35 sensor, and that's so exciting they put that in the name of the camera. Now, that sounds like a lot, but I want to put it in photographic terms as well. That's equivalent to roughly an APS-C sensor with 80 megapixels on it, so it is an absolute ton of resolution. Now, an issue that we have all the time when we're dealing with high-resolution cameras and we're outputting lower-resolution video is the quality really drops. And I'm not just talking about the resolution drop if you're going from, say, a 4K camera to recording 1080, but a lot of the time you'll see a lot more noise, you'll see moire, aliasing. So this actually has a totally different pixel layout in order to offset that a little bit. So given this is a 12K camera, you might think this sensor is just designed to give you the absolute maximum resolution. But what's really interesting is it is built for shooting in those lower resolutions with fewer compromises than other cameras. You look at something like a RED camera, you drop your resolution, it has to crop in. Or you've got something like a lot of older cameras where it would line skip. That would give you a lot of moire, a lot of aliasing, worse noise. Now, there are some cameras that'll actually take that entire high-resolution image, oversample it into like a great 4K image, but you have to remember something like the Canon R5 could do that, and the camera would constantly overheat. So what they've done with this pixel array is it's designed in order to bin down to 8K and 4K, keep the full width of the sensor, but it really avoids a lot of the moire and aliasing that we usually see when we're shooting lower resolution video. Now, don't get me wrong, oversampling is still the way to get the best possible image quality. You can see an example right here. If we shoot 12K and in post convert it down to 4K, you do still get better image quality than shooting in this camera's native 4K mode. But what is really cool here, like I mentioned, we don't see a lot of moire, aliasing, image quality is still very good, but when you drop down to those lower resolutions, rolling shutter does decrease dramatically. I mean, at 12K, it's there, but if you drop this down to 4K, rolling shutter is almost invisible on this sensor. That's also how you can unlock some of the really cool slow motion recording. Doing full width 4K at 4K 120 frames per second, you can get some very nice slow motion out of this. This is a camera you really want to leave at 800 ISO, which is its native sensitivity. Even pushing it up to 1600 ISO here, you can see the noise is quite obtrusive. And also, as we learned in our last video, you really want to avoid underexposing. Bringing it up, things will get very noisy, very muddy very quickly. However, if you shoot this camera at its native 800 ISO, the image quality is absolutely some of the best that I've seen there. Really nice highlight roll off and absolutely tons of detail. The other thing I really like is this camera treats ISO the way I think it should work. You get exactly the same results if you shoot 800 and push it up to 3200 in post as you do if you shoot 3200 ISO in camera. All right, let's talk about B-RAW, which is Blackmagic's RAW video format. And you'd better like it, because unlike a lot of the other Blackmagic cameras, that's all this thing is capable of recording. So let's take a closer look at it. Now, BRAW is a very interesting format because unlike ProRes RAW, we're not counting on Apple to talk to Atomos, to talk to the camera manufacturer, since this is Blackmagic software recording a Blackmagic codec from a Blackmagic camera. There's end-to-end support on it, and that means there's tons of flexibility in these RAW files. Bring them in. You can adjust ISO, white balance, exposure, just like you'd expect with a Red RAW or something like that. Now, BRAW file sizes are also very small considering this is raw data. It's about the same size, a lot of flavors of regular ProRes coming off this. Now you might be wondering, how are we going to record that? And I do actually really like how they handle media. This is one big thing I think Mirrorless could learn. Not so much the SD recording or the ability to record to CFast. I would be fine if CFast just went away forever. They should really be using CF Express, I think, at this point. But what I really love is that you can just plug an external SSD right into the USB-C on this, and it'll treat it just like you plugged a memory card into it. Now remember, using external SSDs is way less expensive than buying a lot of proprietary, especially CFast cards. Okay, so what software can you actually use to edit these monstrous 12K files? Well, right now it's only natively supported in DaVinci Resolve, which makes sense because it's made by Blackmagic, but you can get plugin support for Premiere or Avid as well. But if you're a Final Cut user like me, you are out of luck with that. So once I installed DaVinci Resolve, I was kind of blown away by how editable these files were. I was able to cut 12K and 8K on a 3-year-old MacBook Pro, and it wasn't really giving me any issues. The one thing you do really want to bear in mind, though, is it might be very editable, but those export times will absolutely kill you. It is well over the 4 times you would expect when you're exporting a 4K file. However, if you have a more modern machine, that might be a little bit less of a concern. So after spending a week with this 12K camera, what were my real takeaways? Well, first of all, this is not the right type of camera for shooting our shows. I'm going to be going right back to a mirrorless camera. But then what can mirrorless cameras learn from the technology that we found in this? Well, the first thing is, I think they might want to start looking outside of the Bayer pattern if shooting reduced video resolution is really important. I was very impressed with the binning quality that we saw out of this Blackmagic 12K. I mean, the Bayer pattern is great if you're always going to be using a camera at its highest resolution, but that's becoming the case less and less often. The other thing is, ProRes RAW support is still in a really rough state right now. You don't know what options are going to be supported with the cameras that they use. I would really like to see Apple and Atomos and the camera manufacturers smooth that out so we could expect the same kind of controls no matter which brand or model of camera that we're using. The last thing is, please just let me plug a hard drive into my camera. It was very seamless, and honestly, I actually found the USB-C connection is a lot more solid than the micro HDMI connections that we find ourselves using on a lot of mirrorless cameras right now. But hopefully this gives you something to think about, and if you're really curious about RAW video, be sure to read Richard Butler's recent article on dpreview.com about why RAW video might not be quite as impressive as you'd expect if you're coming from JPEG and RAW photos. Jump isn't quite as big. There's a link to that article in the description below, and there's going to be more Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro 12K content on dpreview.com in the future. But thank you so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all again very soon with more DP Review TV.